I'd like to call the meeting to order. This is a special meeting of the Woodland Davis Clean Water Agency. We have an agenda before us. Are there any changes to this agenda? None. Could I have a motion for approval, please?
So moved.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
That moves us to public comment. Anybody in the audience that would like to speak to us on items that aren't on the agenda, or if you have to leave early and need to speak? Seeing none, rushing to the microphone, I will move to consent items A and B, 4A and B.
Move the consent agenda.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
That passes unanimously, and it takes us to updates. Item 5.
Yes, Chair Souza and board members, it's been a busy few weeks since the board last met on October the 10th, and I'd like to take this opportunity to just kind of update the board on several of the activities. This is an overview of what I'll be covering. I want to focus on several meetings that have occurred relative to the DBO process, talk about some information that has been developed and is being put on our website for interested followers of our program, and talk a little bit about cost and schedule and upcoming activities. Since April, but more specifically in the last few months, there's been considerable progress on the DBO procurement process. As you know, the board authorized the issuance of the draft RFP to the shortlisted DBO firms at your last meeting. There has been good progress on the efforts to obtain project funding. We've received confirmation that the 100% design for the intake facility has been secured from the federal government. We continue to make very good progress on acquisition of property and right-of-way. As you know, we updated our total project cost, total program cost. That number stands at $337 million. We did complete the joint intake design, the joint effort with RD 2035, and we also conducted a water supply optimization analysis. And what that did is it put into proper perspective how the agency will use the 45,000 acre-foot water right, the 10,000 acre-foot acquisition from Conaway, and then what supplemental options are available, either ASR technology, increased conservation, or partnerships with Yolo County. I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the DBO procurement process. We had meetings with each of the 3 DBO teams last week. I think it was a very good discussion. These items that are shown on this slide are the key issues that we reviewed with each of the DBO teams. And we talked about the update on the Davis and also the Woodland rate setting processes, selection factors, price versus non-price, ethics, local contractors, some geotechnical issues, and then what we're calling a project cost optimization concept, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Some of the issues and concerns that were raised by the DBO teams are shown here. Not surprisingly, they had concern over the financial securement of the necessary finances for the project, and reminded us again that they'll be spending several $1 million in putting their proposals together, and the more assurances there are with respect to the funding, the more confident they are that they'll be able to go forward. Talked a little bit about private financing and requirements in the RFP for satisfying the state law, statute 5956, which is the statute we're using to allow us to go forward with the DBO process. Talked about evaluation of non-price selection factors. Based on our meeting last month, it was clear that the board wanted to place a much stronger emphasis on price. And so the question that came up in our discussions, well, then how do we value the non-price selection factors? So we'll be tightening that up in the final RFP, so it's clear how the non-price factors will be weighted in the final selection process, given the fact that we've made it very clear that price is the most important factor. They wanted to get clarification on permit responsibility and the schedule, so we'll be clearing that up in the final as well. Ethics policy approval. What we talked to them about and what we're proposing to move forward with is a process where we would require each of the shortlisted firms to submit information in response to a questionnaire that we would send out. And we would propose that we would bring that requested submittal, the information that we're going to require of each of these firms, back to the board in January, give the board a final look at it, then issue that to each of the 3 DBO firms, have them complete our questionnaire, supply the requested information, and bring that back to the board for your approval with respect to their ethics policy in the February timeframe. And we think we'd rather take that approach in that they're very concerned about getting to the end of the line, spending several $1 million, and then have that question determined. So we thought it would be appropriate to do that upfront before they get actively engaged in the RFP process. Talked a little bit about reliance on background data, somewhat technical, the geotechnical reports and some of the other information. To what extent should they be relying on it or being required to develop additional new information on their own? We talked about filling the treatment plant site, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then finally, coordination with the joint intake, the design build contractor that is being solicited as part of our joint intake project, and RD 2035 is taking the lead on. So we just wanted to take the opportunity to make sure that we were well coordinated on how those 2 contracts will interface. So this is a concept that we talked to each of the DBO contractors about. And this responds specifically to what we've been hearing from this board and other members of the public, in that we say that the engineer's estimate is $337 million. And then we also say we expect to save 15 to 30% by using the DBO procurement methodology. But we're still using $337 million in all of our publications, in all of our rate-setting activities, et cetera. So what we talked about is working cooperatively with each DBO team to effectively incorporate the savings into our cost estimate. So we would want to come up with a cap, a lower number than what we're currently showing, a cap for what we think is the minimum savings we're going to get with the DBO process, and get each one of them to agree that that's the maximum we're going to pay for the DBO contract, and then use that lowered number and build that into our rate setting process and our revenue projections. So we think we'll be able to better explain, by doing that with a lower number, why the DBO process makes sense. A little bit about the treatment plant site and the preloading. The site needs to be raised by about 12 feet. And this is a site that is being acquired from Woodland, and we would borrow the materials from the ponds adjacent to the site. And we think that if we went ahead and filled the site this spring and the early summer, ahead of the contractor, the DBO contractor coming on board, we would be able to better stabilize the site for construction of the treatment plant. It would allow for what they call preloading and consolidation of the site so that we have less soil issues and concerns. It would eliminate the potential for project delays that would be related to either weather or endangered species issues when you're prohibited from moving dirt. And it would also create the detention ponds for Woodland quicker. It costs about $1.5 to $2.5 million. We haven't developed the detailed scope yet, but our thought would be to proceed with that work and have a contract ready for the board in the springtime so that that work could be done in the next construction window, allow for consolidation of the site, and best prepare it for the DBO contractor to take over. As I mentioned, there's been a lot of discussion around the DBO procurement process. We have scheduled a meeting at the Woodland Community Center on December 8th at 6 p.m. When we made a presentation to the Davis City Council last week, they asked if we could schedule a second meeting. So we've set that for December 14th at 6 p.m. That will allow us to have both public meetings prior to the due date of comments on the draft RFP of December 17th. Also, in conjunction with the DBO procurement process, there's a fairly extensive analysis that was prepared by our Facilities Procurement Committee, and we've gone ahead and posted that October 10th project delivery analysis memo that looked at all the different options for project delivery on the agency website. So this is, again, you've seen this schedule before, but this is our DBO procurement schedule. The next activity is the community meetings that I just mentioned, receipt of public comment on December 17th, incorporation of those comments into a final RFP, and if all goes well, request the agency consider issuing the final RFP in January. Another topic of interest to the community has been project alternatives. There has been a lot of work done over the last few years, tremendous amount of work over various alternatives. Those alternatives have been summarized in a memorandum that was released last week. The memorandum goes through 26 different alternatives that were evaluated, the 3 that were considered viable, and why the current project remains the recommended project. And that summary memorandum is being posted also to the agency website. Just a brief comment or two on our presentation to the Davis City Council. That was a request by the community that the agency appear at the Davis City Council meeting on the 15th. And we had a good discussion. Questions came up regarding contaminant concentrations versus drinking water standards, facility costs and how the costs are allocated to each city, and wastewater compliance schedules. I think the council viewed the exchange as helpful and asked us to regularly provide project updates to the council, and we'll certainly want to make sure that that same opportunity is extended to Woodland. With respect to the facility cost and the allocation, we went right to work on that question, prepared this table here, which provides a concise summary of the total project cost, the $337 million that you can see at the bottom of the total column, the Woodland and Davis share for each of the project components, the percentage share for Woodland and Davis. In the very last column, we've added a column that shows the total amount of the DBO contract. And so the amount that is currently estimated is almost $233 million. That's the number that I spoke to previously that we're going to sit down with the DBO teams and see if we can't incorporate the projected 15 to 30% savings and lower that number, and as a result lower the overall $337 million total project cost. We've also been spending some time looking at Plan B and C and D. Should there be problems with financing or other unforeseen circumstances on the project, we're currently looking at 3 different schedule scenarios. One would be the current project schedule with the rate setting processes that we understand underway in both Davis and Woodland. We're also looking at what the impacts of a 1-year delay would be and trying to quantify the cost associated with that level of delay, and then kind of hopefully a very remote scenario where we would look at a delay of 5 years. And under that last scenario, what we would be looking at is configuring a facility that would be initially sized for Woodland only. This is coming at the request of the Woodland staff and working with both Davis and Woodland and West Yost to come up with a costing of this scenario. One option is to build the Woodland standalone project at initial 20 MGD, and then expandable to 26 would be the ultimate capacity. A second configuration would be to build a plant for Woodland at 20 MGD, but to build it so that Davis could join in at a later date and build the plant to accommodate an ultimate 40 and then 52 MGD capacity, and then develop comparative cost differences and identify risks and uncertainties with these different scenarios. So we hope to have that analysis complete in about a week or so, so that it will hopefully answer people's questions about what would be the effect of delaying a project for a year, 5 years, or anything in between. Finally, just in getting close to wrapping up here, just want to remind the board that this is a list of kind of the critical path items, things that we need to accomplish in the coming months and years in order to keep our project on schedule for completion in 2016. We're making good progress on the land and easement acquisitions, the securing of the funding for the intake site. We need to concentrate on the permits and CEQA documentation this coming year and get that completed by next fall. Continue to work on securing funding for the DBO contract from each of the cities, and hopefully have that in place, by fall, early winter next year. And that would put us in position to award the DBO contract in February of 2013 and maintain our current completion schedule of 2016. This is a kind of a 3-month look ahead in terms of what's on our plate the next 3 months. We want to finalize the property procurement for the water treatment plant, complete the draft RFP process and issue the final RFP in January, continue to work and complete the property acquisitions, start the 100% design of the intake, and then we'll also be required to prepare our urban water management plan, and that'll be coming to the board early to mid to spring next year. This is a schedule that you've seen many times before. Focus currently in 2011, 2012 is on the design, permitting, financing, and the DBO procurement, hoping to be able to move into construction in 2013. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that the board may have.
Questions?
I do have some too.
Yeah, okay. If I was keeping track, then there are 3 separate contracts, 2 design bid builds, one for the intake facility, and one you're proposing to elevate the site 12 feet, and then a DBO's contract.
Yeah, that's correct. There you have the partner. We have the partnership with RD 2035 for the intake,
Right.
and we're working with them on that. There would be the DBO procurement contract for the treatment plant and related transmission pipelines and facilities, and then what we're proposing is to pull out of that contract this separate contract to fill the site ahead of the DBO contract coming on board.
With the uncertainty in the financing, would it make sense to ask the DBO proposals to segment the project into a Woodland only and then Woodland plus Davis?
Well, I think that the analysis that I mentioned that we're currently conducting will give the board and others a chance to look at what the implications of phasing would be, and then from that, I think that there's options that the board could ask us to pursue or investigate. But I think that's the first step, is really to understand what the implications of the delay are, and then lay out alternatives from there.
And do we have any timeline of the certainty on the financing, answering that question?
Well, what we understand the process to be is in Woodland, that you're going through a planning next year to go through a 218 process to secure the remaining funding for the latter years of the project. And our understanding in Davis is that they formed a citizens advisory committee. They're going to be looking at a rate study analysis, and they'll be completing that over the next 6 to 9 months and either reaffirm the rates that have been put in place previously or, depending on the results of the study, come up with a new rate schedule and scenario that would then be required to have another 218 process, and that would, if we understand the schedule correctly, take place, late fall of next year. And Joe may have more to say on that.
So we're probably looking at a year from now, where we'll have any kind of firm sense as to what size this project is going to be and how it's being financed.
Yeah. The current, that's our understanding of the current schedule, and in terms of the activities that the agency would be undertaking are consistent with that schedule. And if the rates are put in place by, mid to late next year, we should be able to maintain the current schedule.
Okay.
I can speak to the Davis side of rates. You can speak to the Woodland side of rates, but I would say that for both of us, the totality of the funds for the project by both of our communities have not totally been secured. You have a process to still go through.
Sure.
You're further along than we are. We have a council meeting on December 6th where a qualified referendum will come back to us. We will look at the options that are available to us. And then we will move forward with one of, as the city attorney has spelled out to us, 4 different options. We will be evaluating all of them and what is in the best interest of the ratepayers of our community and in the best interest of the project that we have before us as a JPA. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it didn't. That's
You
all
know,
right.
in life, well, in this particular case, there is no real certainty until you actually have bonded the money for the project in and of itself.
But I'm understanding that in order to do the bonding, unless you go totally private financing, you need to have the rates in place to provide that revenue stream that you're basing the bonding on.
That is correct.
So we're back to the same place.
For both of us. For both of us.
Right.
You're a little bit further ahead by a few years than we are. We're behind when it comes to our portion of the project and the bonding on the setting of rates that are necessary to assure that those private bonds, and we've all been looking at it from a private financing perspective, there's other perspectives that we can look at. They aren't as sure. And in fact, I would say even private bonding isn't a certainty either. There are some uncertainties that are within that particular framework. We need greater certainty, I would agree with you. But this is a completely different world we're living in when it comes to the capacity to do these things in a manner that brings greater assurances. And from the city, and as a council member from the city, I'm going to do all that I can to bring assurances because I am 100% committed to a safe, reliable water source for our community and for your community for that matter too.
Go ahead.
My turn?
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
one of my questions just centered around getting a better understanding of where Davis was at this point. I don't feel like I have a good understanding of what the options that you'll be considering are, and where you're standing in relation to the overall project. Certainly, it seems to me like the partnership that we entered into would be a huge consideration, as well as the considerations that you have in relation to your own rates. And if there is going to be negative fallout to Woodland, then I need to clearly understand that as well. And certainly, from my limited perspective, it would seem a delay in the project will only impact both cities negatively, but certainly would impact Woodland negatively. So I just need to have an understanding of where we're at, and maybe Dennis, you know that, or maybe
Let me just offer,
Joe,
from
can.
the project's perspective, I think that we can maintain the current schedule if Davis completes their 218 process by fall to this time next year. So the process that I understand, they're going to go through another process with their Citizens Advisory Group. They're going to look at doing a rate study. They're either going to reaffirm their current 218 process or potentially do another 218 process. If all that gets accomplished by this time next year, we'll be able to maintain our current schedule. And I think the key thing in terms of the DBO's comfort level in being able to sign a contract is if that 218 process is complete. I think that's kind of the step that needs to be in place.
To give you specific options that were laid out to us, and these options are just 4 options. There are a multitude of others that are based upon these scenarios, but several of them are cut and dry. First one is we can send the issue of the rates to the voters of the citizens of Davis at either a special election or at the next general municipal election. Option 2 would be complete repeal of the 5-year rates that were set under the Prop 218 process that we've gone through. Option 3 is to set a 1-year or less than 5-year rates and repeal the remaining portion of the Prop 218 rates that were set that have been now subject to a referendum, a qualified referendum. Option 4 is the one that nobody has ever entered into, but our attorney has given us legal advice that it is an option, and it's the option of doing nothing, keeping the rates as they are, because under her review, she believes that a referendum is the inappropriate means by which you overturn an ordinance of setting of rates. Those are the 4 options that have been spelled out to us in a memorandum from our city attorney. And we will be reviewing that memorandum, and we as a council will determine what is the best path for our citizens moving forward. Joe?
Yeah, no, I think that's very good, Stephen. I mean, I think the bottom line is that the council really does have many options in how it chooses to respond to, implement the referendum, and it's going to come up at our December 6th meeting, and we'll know after that meeting what the impact would be on the timing of this project, and then ultimately, the people will decide whether or not the timing of the project and the implementation of the project as well. So we're just not going to know until we get past our December 6th meeting. And I think that there's a number of forums for very good thinking on this, but it is a weighing of many values, both process and substantive. So I think that's all we can really say at this point in time. I guess I will mention that if there is delay, and I expect there to be delay in one form or another, for what duration I don't know, as a result of the referendum, I am concerned about how that would impact competitive bidding in the DBO environment. And I think I want to encourage the Clean Water Agency staff to think about that. Because if we go forward with a DBO process and there's too much of a cloud over the financing, and we don't get the quality of bids that we would like to get, then we will have missed one of the most important opportunities for this agency to get cost reduction. So I think that's a key question that we're going to have to think about before too long, and we're going to need some kind of professional help, I think, in how that question is resolved by this whole board that's here today. So,
yes, I mean, certainly the Davis decisions that they're going to make on December 6th are going to be very, very important. all I can say is that the more certain the process that's laid out and the more assurances that we can give the DBO teams that there's a plan in place to have the rate issue resolved by this time next year, the more they're going to be willing to continue forward and respond to the RFP. The less certainty there are with respect to the rates, the more chance that they're not going to be willing or want to proceed with their investments.
I have a question. Oh,
Go ahead,
sir.
Sid.
Yes, please.
Sorry, we'd asked, several people had spoken. Bill, I forgot you were actually had the floor at the moment, so if you...
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. When you were laying out the alternatives there and having it done by next fall, one of the alternatives was another 218 process. Would that schedule also include the resolution of any potential, whether it's a referendum or an initiative or whatever, that might affect that 218 process? Should that also be part of the schedule by next fall, or is that beyond anything we can plan for?
I think the implicit in the assumption that if there were another 218 process, that it's assumed that that would be a successful 218 process by about this time next year.
So my question is, what I'm hearing is that you're talking about a delay almost no matter what in the project here, if I'm hearing that correctly.
I think if there's a clear schedule that's laid out and there's a process that concludes with a successful 218 process this time next year, we can stay on our current schedule, which is to complete the project by 2016. We may, suffer a 2 or 3 month delay, but we can accommodate that in the overall schedule and still complete the project by 2016. If that scenario doesn't...
And you've talked to the teams about that and feel confident in that statement from those discussions?
Well, successful that we can accomplish all of the steps that are required in terms of the technical details and the actual construction activities. There's still an overlying uncertainty with respect to the DBO's confidence to proceed in the current uncertain rate environment, but assuming that the decision that Davis makes on December 6th facilitates resolution of the rates by this time next year, that would put us in the position to have maximum confidence from the DBO folks to proceed. If we don't hit that target, you're really talking about losing an entire construction year. That's why we're going to be analyzing the effects of a 1-year delay. You only have certain construction windows that you can complete activities. If we don't hit that target of this time next year, then we're really looking at a year delay.
Let me phrase my question differently. If the rate-setting process, which had come to a completion in Davis, if the rate-setting process is reinstituted and you're in a year from now has resolution or is on the path to resolution, is it your opinion that that alternative would not cost the partners in this agency any additional money than than what we are about currently?
Yes, because the current schedule calls for us to issue or sign the DBO contract. I think it's in
February 2013.
February 2013. If you have the rates in place, late 2012, we can stay on this schedule.
Well, I didn't ask about the schedule. I asked about the cost. Are you confident
Yes.
in making a statement that this potential option in Davis that is now being discussed will not cost the project any additional funding?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but.
Yeah.
assuming that the DBO contractors remain confident and continue to participate in the
Sure.
process.
I mean, it just seems to me like it's inherently obvious, to me anyway, that a delay like that is going to cost more bucks. And we're at a prime bidding time in the current history.
I think the answer is that none of the scheduled procurement activities, whether it be filling the site, continuing with RD 2035, or
Right.
signing the DBO contract, are going to be delayed under the scenario that we just discussed. Once we start getting to the point where we have to delay any of those procurements, then there's going to be an increase in cost.
Sure. But I think it's logical that, and you correct me if you disagree, please, that's why I'm asking the questions, but it just seems logical to me that if things are delayed and there is still uncertainty, that that would necessitate at least I would assume on two city staffs' timetables, a great deal of additional time and consulting to look at other alternatives that would have to be looked at that point because of the delay, that wouldn't have to be looked at if we were not considering delaying. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, for example, I know that currently Woodland City staff are asking the question and pursuing some answers, I think, with you and with West Jost. Well, what does it look like if we have to go about this alone? And I know you've just told us you're going to bring some of that back in terms of cost, but it just seems something ought to be in place in regards to those amounts of monies prior to their city council meeting.
I understand your question. We are incurring additional administrative cost to deal with an analysis of potential delays, analysis of different scenarios, phasing of the treatment plant, all of that sort of activity. So there are additional administrative and relatively minor engineering costs associated with that activity. When I said the overall project wouldn't suffer a delay, I was talking about actually designing and procuring the facilities. And if we don't delay those, then the overall project cost in terms of construction costs should not be impacted significantly.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You've done?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Don?
I actually share Mr. Marble's questioning, and just to kind of get a sense of how to interpret the comments that you've made, Mr. Deemer. I kind of understand that if you look at the schedule, that the procurement process wouldn't necessarily delay as a result of other elements of the schedule not happening as they were slated to take place. However, I am concerned. It's curious to me that say the financing aspect that I understood was going to be reliant on bonding against revenue stream from a guaranteed rate stream. Is that not delayed by the uncertainty about the 218 process in Davis? And if that is delayed, then doesn't that result in a lack of confidence? And it seems to me that many people outside this room, perhaps maybe some in this room, are wondering what's going to happen, and their degree of investment and commitment to the project timeline is probably diminished. So I'm not sure that, I think if all things are equal, and then I can sort of understand on a technical standpoint that if we look at a schedule, this thing doesn't happen till then, but getting to that point with a lot of other free actors in play seems vastly undermined.
Yeah, try a different response. Any decision by this board that would be prompted by rate issues, rate concerns, or any other concerns, any action that this board would take to either slow down the design and construction of the intake facility, slow down the award of the DBO contract in 2013, would add cost to the project. But the way that the staff is approaching it now is we're assuming that we're on the current schedule. We plan to bring the necessary approvals and contract items for the board consideration according to our current schedule. And if we do that, and if the board approves those, then we should not suffer any delay, any cost associated with delay.
It's, I think that one thing I'm trying to understand in your comments is the effect of the possible defeat of a matter that the Davis City Council might choose to put on a ballot. And the fact that we don't know if that's going to be, if they're going to do that, if the council's going to do that, or if the voters are going to go a certain way, and how doesn't that impact the whole operation of this project?
I think it definitely depends on what the city council decides on December 6th. Depending on that array that Chair Souza described,
Okay.
We may be back at this board in January with a scenario that doesn't allow us to assure that the schedule can proceed as planned, and we would have to make adjustments. There's also other options that the council, we understand the council's considering, that would allow this agency to proceed on the current schedule. So we'll know a lot more after that meeting.
Yeah.
The other thing that we'll know is, depending on what action the city council takes, what effect it has on the current 3 DBO teams and their willingness to continue in the process while the rate issue is being resolved. And the more certainty that the council decision provides to the more assurances it gives that the rate issue will be resolved next year, the more likely they are to want to continue to participate in the process. That if it's uncertain, we may learn that one or more of them is just not ready to spend their money given the level of uncertainty. So it's that kind of scenario.
I'm just trying to understand this as we think about what might happen in regard to the project timeline, the project cost, or the project continuing at all.
Let me suggest that maybe the best thing we can do is to learn what the city of Davis decides at their meeting on December 6th, and then come back with a more detailed explanation of what the schedule would look like or how that decision would be incorporated into our schedule in January.
And my caution for my colleagues here and for others who are observing this discussion is in understanding your comment about no change to the project so long as the 218 is completed by default by a year from now. That assumes that everybody believes that the outcome a year from now is a positive one that assures a funding stream based on ratepayers' concurrence. And I don't think that we can state that that's the underlying assumption.
Don? Go ahead, Marty.
Yeah, that's one of my concerns, too. We talk about a successful Prop 218 process, and there was one already. But if there's another one, then it's not just that the rates have to be able to be increased over a certain frame, but they also have to be increased enough to sustain the revenue stream for us to be able to bond against it. If it's not sufficient 218, then we're back at the same place. Not enough money to actually participate in the project.
Marty, I would add this, and it kind of plays off of Don's phrase of lack of confidence. I can give you 4 other scenarios where there is lack of confidence. There's lack of confidence in whether the State Water Resources Control Board will split our senior water rights from CPG. That hasn't been done. We don't know for certain. There's protests that have been filed, so there's uncertainty in that. There is federal and state funding for an intake facility. We have design money, but we don't have federal money for construction. That's lack of uncertainty and lack of confidence. The other one would be, you have not fully set your rates. You have to go through a Prop 218 process, just as we have gone through a Prop 218 process and may have to go through another Prop 218 process. So there's no certainty in any of those scenarios. We don't know for a fact that we all have the money that's necessary or the necessary other components that I just mentioned to actually come with a completed project. All we know for certain is we want this, we're going forward, and we know for certain, at least from a Davis City Council standpoint, in 15 days, we're going to discuss this, and we will have a path that we'll pursue to hopefully uphold our portion of this agreement that we have signed and we are fully committed to. And that I know for certain. Other than that, there's a lot of uncertainty still.
One of the questions I'd like to ask, and it may be Woodland staff that has to answer it, I'm not sure, is that if there is a delay in the project, but we are proceeding in the project, is that going to allow us to ask for some sort of an extension on our wastewater treatment discharge permit?
Would you repeat the last half of that question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
Well, because I know we're up against a timeline on the wastewater treatment plant discharge permit. And I'm wondering if we have a delay here, if we're still actively participating and moving towards a completed project, even though it's been delayed for one reason or another, are we still going to be in a position to ask for that, ask for an extension?
Well, we're certainly in a position to ask. Our permit is due in 2016. In October of 2016, our time order runs out. We're certainly in a position to ask for an additional extension, although they've made it very clear to us that what we're working off of right now is the end of a series of extensions for both cities, and they would have to seriously consider whether or not to grant us that. I think that Mr. Deemer is correct that if we make a couple of key strategic moves right now, that we can stay in this game and go forward. In the meantime, Woodland staff is looking at what options Woodland would have in this situation, where if Davis was unable to continue at the same pace, how would we fit that into a project that would include them, but they would be coming forward at a slower pace, what that would look like.
And
so we're in the middle of that study.
And just to clarify for me, Mr. Sousa's mentioned a couple of times our own Prop 218 process. When's our next one up?
We're at we're going to have our draft rates going to be done in December. We'll be taking that to the rate study for review. We'll start the 218 process after the beginning of the year.
Okay.
So, and I think the process is due in June.
And that sets for another 5 years? Is that right?
That's what we're studying right now. Is it going to be 3 years? Is it going to be 4? So far, I haven't heard 5 years, but it's quite possible that
But is that sufficient to pay for our portion of the project?
That's correct.
Okay.
That would be for looking at paying for our portion, or what our portion possibly could be if Davis determines that they need to slow down their process to extend out their rate increases, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
We good with this? It was an update, but I think we got more than that.
Yeah. Yeah, I do have a couple of comments when you're ready, Mr. Chair.
Sure, please.
I understand the difficulties that my colleagues have on your rate-setting process, and I don't want to sound like I'm callous to that, because I'm not. But I am extremely concerned and hopeful that you will take into that discussion some points that I view as very, very important. And I don't have them written down, so I'm running the risk of speaking off of the top of my head. But I'll outline just a couple of those that have been in my mind. Number one, I think there is a very significant risk to the Term 91 water right that we obtained earlier this year if if in some way this process doesn't move forward in a way that we depicted to the State Water Resources Control Board that it would. I understand the difference between the regional board and the state board. State board gave us that water right. The state board has the ability to deal with it in some other way if we're not fulfilling our end of it. And that was a major accomplishment. We all celebrated that accomplishment. But I am concerned that with whatever happens in Davis, that water right could potentially be lost if it doesn't go in the right direction. And I'd urge you to keep that in mind. The other concern I have is that, and I know you'll wrestle with this, but there's a great deal in my mind of uncertainty in continuing to prolong the process. And there is uncertainty in my mind as to the final result of another 218 process. And sometimes it's better to bite the bullet and to move ahead, and you'll have to decide if this is the right time for you to do that. But I would urge you to consider that, because you have conducted a legal 218 process. Many have questioned along the way, how do those who are not ratepayers have the right legally to trump a decision made by ratepayers? I personally asked that question, and I guess there is now a legal response to that, surely debated by others, but I think there was a legitimate rate-setting process, and I personally am of the opinion that sometimes you have to just move ahead, and I hope you'll take that into consideration. I think also that this very significant accomplishment that we've had in forging a partnership with this even-numbered board is critical, that we continue to view this as a partnership venture. And I, for one, certainly do, and would just encourage that in your analysis, though you have a fiduciary responsibility to the citizens of Woodland, you also, in my view, have a fiduciary responsibility to your partner in this venture, and potential a partner in the venture, and I would hope that would just be kept in mind, and I'm sure it will. I know both of you, and I'm sure it will, but that to me is also a very important item that maybe has been missed by the larger community, that we do have a responsibility to the partnership we forged and to the direction that we were authorized to forge as an agency. So I would hope that would be considered. And then one last, unless something else comes to my mind, one last concern I have is that, as you all know, I've been very active, and I'll give a report when the time comes as to some of those lobbying activities that I've been involved in, about 4 or 5 meetings in the last month alone with key people, together with Reclamation District 2035 and together with Tri-City Farms, in pursuing funding for the joint intake structure. And a great deal of that effort has been focused around not only the partnership between us and the Reclamation District, but also between the partnership between Woodland and Davis, and the timetable. We have advocated for what we're advocating based on a timetable. And Steve, you know that. You've been in Washington with me. We have lobbied heavily, both Congress and at board levels, for the funding that we needed based on our fulfilling our obligation to have this done by 2016. And I think that's pretty critical. I'll say this now instead of later. One of the meetings we had 3 weeks ago at the Bureau of Reclamation office, here, the Western office of the Bureau, it became very clear during that meeting that we were no longer the third key facility for that funding to be part of, but we were now as soon as Natomas is done, we're the priority. We're not waiting for another group ahead of us. And in fact, part of that discussion centered around the need to massage how that funding would come to the suggested by the Bureau of Reclamation that maybe some advance funding could take place. I don't think we had ever even conceived of that being discussed at their level, but it is being discussed. And if we now put out a signal that, well, we may not be able to be done by 2016, I'm very concerned about the way we appear in terms of our story, which I've presented frequently in a very open and honest way. What that does to our credibility in terms of the funding we're about asking, and the partnerships that we're about forging. And I fear that we could lose far more than a few dollars in administrative additional costs to look at some of these options. I just fear we can lose far more financially, and in the end, a far greater cost to both of our communities. I jokingly have said to a couple of colleagues, well, maybe Woodland should just go build this alone, and we'll when Davis comes, we'll charge top dollar for the project. But that is, I say that jokingly because that's not part of the partnership that I believe in. So I just hope that those few things that have come to mind that and you, I'm sure, have already thought of as you're grappling with the decision you've got to make, I just hope those will be part of that consideration. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're quite welcome, partner. Joe.
A couple of questions. I hope they're quick. Dennis, you mentioned this water supply acquisition work that you guys were doing. You mentioned it's part of the overview. Is that a report or a section
Yes.
of a report? And
Yeah, it's a memorandum.
okay. And have we received that, or is that something we
It
could?
was done before I started.
Was it?
No, the water supply analysis memo.
Yeah.
Was it a prior meeting? That's that same. Okay. Right. Okay. Good. There's nothing new
No.
on that, and that was really at our last meeting.
Yeah, and
Right
that
here,
was,
yeah.
exactly, and it
Okay.
was just on the list of things that we had accomplished in the last 6
Got
months.
it. Okay, got it. That's great. And then what's the timing you estimate? You talked about the process here where you're going to look to revise the cost estimates for the project to kind of, to some extent, sync up the fact that we're saying this is the engineering estimate, but this is the savings we want. So I liked hearing that we were going to do that, and
Yes.
the process itself made sense to me of how we would do that. But what would the timing be for that?
Soon, in the next, I would say, 3 to 4 weeks. We have to
Okay.
do some analysis ourselves. We want to check in with our DBO teams to make sure whatever number we're going to try and establish as a cap that they're
Okay.
comfortable with. And I may ask Jim, is that 3 or 4 weeks in? About 3 to 4 weeks, we hope to
Okay,
have that in
okay,
place.
yeah, that's, it's in the month to 2 month category
Yeah.
or as opposed to the 4 month category or
Yes.
something like that. Okay, that's good. And then, is there any update on the financing options that we're looking into for the project? You know, whether we're talking state revolving loan fund or other things? Are we kind of actively trying to get to the bottom of those options?
Yeah, we have work to do there. We've got a very good plan in place on the intake. We have to duplicate or match that for some of the agency facilities. We have a very important meeting that's coming up next week with Jerry Merrill, where we're hoping to get some insight and advice on where we might be able to find the state matching funds. So that'll trigger a series of activities on our part as well.
Okay. So I would just encourage staff to know that, I'm very interested in that coming back to us, at any meeting, in any update where we are on the financing. And also, apropos to Director Marble's comments, if we're doing delay analysis, I'd be interested in how the finance piece relates to the delay analysis. I mean, for example, if we get into the state revolving loan fund, maybe once we're in, we're good for a couple of years or not. I don't know. So are there pieces of financing that we might be able to get that we'd be sacrificing if we delay? Or I just don't know how to think about that. But potentially, it has a great impact, I think, on the long-term cost to the ratepayers.
It does, and we'll try to capture some of that in this memorandum that I discussed that will be completing next week, some of the risks and uncertainties that go along with delay.
Right, that's perfect. Yeah, and again, I know that's it's hard to do, right? Where a lot of this is tough, but I want to see it as part of the equation.
Yeah. Definitely. And I think just based on the board's conversation here the last few minutes, and I may be stating the obvious, but there is a lot of momentum behind the project right now, and a lot of things lining up very favorably that a delay would impact, and we would lose that momentum, and that could certainly add to cost.
Very much so.
Great. Thank you very much, Dennis.
So without further delay, we'll move to the next item on our agenda.
Okay, so this is a request for the board to consider approving task order number 2 with Montgomery Watson Harza. I need to point out under the fiscal impact section on the front page, there's a typo. It indicates that the agency share is $290,000. Actually, that $290,000 is the agency portion for its separate facilities. There's an additional $208,000 for the agency share of the common facilities with RD 2035. The correct number is $499,487, and that number is accurately reflected on the second page of your report, where it gets into the under the heading of task order number 2. So we wanted to point that out. This is a recommendation to the agency entered into a contract or an agreement with Montgomery Watson Harza in partnership with Reclamation District 2035 earlier this year, March of this year, for the 30% design. This task order that's before you this afternoon would authorize us to proceed with 100% design. And as I mentioned earlier, we have secured the $1.165 million in funding from the federal government that will offset these costs.
Do we need a motion? I move the item.
Second.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Passes unanimously. That'll move us to item 7.
Yes, board members, this is a request to consider approving an agreement with Northwest Hydraulic Consultants for a river sediment assessment and related services. As explained in the staff report, this is an issue that pertains specifically to the agency because the agency will be operating the intake facility during the winter when we anticipate issues with sediment loading. This project was originally included in the Montgomery scope, but we felt it was better, since it was an agency-specific issue, that we could have better control and direction to the consultant to handle it directly. This will give us information on the sediment load that we anticipate in the winter, and allow us to come up with ways to deal with that, either through operation or design modifications.
I have one question. Mr. Chair, when you're ready, I understand that you're recommending a group that is only $3,000 or $4,000 above competitor in price, but they are still higher priced than the next firm, and I think it's incumbent upon us to justify that higher cost. So could you do that for us?
Yes, let me ask Jim or Monique to address that. And I know that was an issue that was carefully considered in making this recommendation.
I'm sure it was. I just think we need to justify it.
Jim Yost from West Yost. We did, in fact, get 2 solid proposals and had discussions with a third firm. We actually asked for proposals from 4 firms. Northwest Hydraulics was slightly higher, but had a more detailed scope and a more complete scope, we felt, than the firm that was slightly less, and so that's why we thought they offered the best value to the agency.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions? I have one. As I understand it, they'll be dredging dredging the bottom of the river 500 to 1,000 feet upstream and downstream. So the question is, and I can understand upstream, that makes a lot of sense because material would be passing by the intake facility. Why are they analyzing material downstream? Are we figuring there's some backflow and material would be coming on the backside sucked in by the pump?
I'll ask Jim to address that as well, but I think what we're attempting to do is get a good soil sediment profile in and around the intake structure.
The objective of this analysis to help us get a clear understanding of the amount of sediment that would be coming into the intake. And if we just measure upstream, it's possible we would have missed some of that load moving past the site. So it's just really to confirm that, in fact, we're correctly measuring the amount of sediment.
So the size, the amount?
I'm sorry?
The quantity, the size?
Yeah, there's some, I don't know how familiar you are with the sediment movement in the Sacramento River. It's a fascinating study. There are actually waves of sand that move down through the system during the winter months when the flows are high. And so we want to get a good handle on these and how they might impact our design of the intake.
And this particular expense is not included in the current agency budget?
That's correct. It would have to come out of the contingency budget.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Yost.
It's a result of all your water skiing stirring up the mud
It
over
must
there,
be.
Steve.
That's what it is.
It's got to be, Bill. Any further questions? Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second?
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Passes unanimously. That takes us to item number 8, which is consider approving amendments to installment purchase agreement with the cities of Davis and Woodland and Tri-City Waters and Conway Preservation Group.
These are fairly straightforward amendments to tighten up our current agreements, and I'll let Dick expand on that.
As the board members may recall, last December you purchased water rights from Conway Ranch in a complicated transaction. Part of that transaction had each of the cities secure that purchase obligation through an installment purchase agreement to help protect the seller, that the cities are going to stand behind the agency's purchase. After the ink was dry on those various documents that were signed back in December, the city's attorneys as well as the seller's attorneys took a harder look at those installment purchase agreements, and they're now recommending some changes and clarifications to clarify the deal. The first change involves some modifying and adding some definitions to make it clear that the city's pledge of revenue doesn't include certain refundable deposits that get booked as as revenue, and to make it clear that those are not available. And then the other significant change is there's the installment purchase agreement included a prepayment concept where the cities had the opportunity and right to prepay this debt, and the change would be to provide a more specific formula for how that would happen. I want to quickly add that these are the cities primarily have taken the lead on developing these documents, and the city attorneys in negotiation with the seller's attorneys. The agency needs to be a party simply because we're also a party to these deals. For the directors, you guys in your city council capacities will be considering these agreements also soon at an upcoming meeting for the cities. And the city staffs at that time, frankly, may have a lot better background and understanding about these changes, because we're just trying to facilitate them because we're a part of these contracts, but this is really city attorney driven. Primarily your bond counsel in Riverside has been working on this matter. But with that, I'll try and address any questions you may have.
Questions? No one?
None.
Motion for approval?
So moved.
It's been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Passes unanimously. That takes us to item 9, which is resolution revising the schedule and location of our future board meetings.
Yes, so board members, we're recommending that the board adopt the revised schedule that is contained in the staff report. It looks like we're going to be quite busy in the next year, so we would recommend setting a monthly meeting at a time certain. Also, as indicated in your staff report, I think there is going to be times where we're not going to need to meet every month, in which case we would cancel the meeting, but this would give us the ability to calendar it and not have to search for alternative dates.
I've got a conflict already on one of those dates in February. I will not be in the state on that date, so I don't know how, I just wanted to bring that up in advance.
On the third Thursday, so we have to seek an alternative.
In February, I won't be here.
February date to it. Yep. Mr. General Manager, can you make note of that, sir?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else, at least for now, see a conflict with any dates? Hearing none, can I have a motion for approval of the schedule?
So moved.
Moved.
Second.
Seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Passes unanimously. That takes us to our long-range calendar. Do you have it?
And this kind of relates to the item that the board just approved. This is actually maybe difficult for you to see. I think there are copies at your places, however. This is like a look-ahead, 12-month look-ahead calendar, where what we're trying to do at the staff level is identify critical board items and decision points throughout the calendar year. What we would propose is to include this in your monthly packet going forward, and we would ask that if the board sees anything that we haven't included or things that you have questions on, that you let us know. And this is kind of a, as I said, a look ahead for the year.
Are we not meeting in March?
The calendar shows no meeting in March and August.
Or November.
Or November, yes.
Currently, we don't have items that need the board attention in those months. As we proceed and bring this forward to the board each meeting, we'll update it and add and subtract items as appropriate.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. That's an informational item. That takes us to the technical committee comments.
Technical committee has nothing to report at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Board member comments.
I have some, but I don't want to go first.
Anybody
I'm happy to
else?
go first, whatever you want, Mr. Chair.
Oh, go first, Bill.
Go ahead, Bill. Come on. Step out
I just
there, my
wanted,
friend.
I did want to talk about a couple of things I've been involved in, just so the board is updated. Together with RD 2035, Mr. Stuart Somack, and a Todd Manley who represents NACWA. And NACWA has become very involved in supporting both the Woodland Davis surface water project, and I think that's significant, and also in supporting our efforts in this joint funding of the intake structure. So Todd Manley has been to every meeting that I've attended over the last month and a half and lent his support from the NACWA end. And I think that's just important to note. And I think it would be well for the agency to send a note to NACWA thanking them for their efforts in our behalf there. I did attend a meeting with DWR. That meeting was significant because DWR really, I felt like DWR was very much trying to support the efforts that we're making in moving forward with this project. There was some discussion there about Mr. Somac's resolution of some of the protests for splitting off the water right that you mentioned previously, but I will say that one of the most significant protests was resolved within a day or two of that meeting. And that may not be public knowledge, but those protests are getting resolved in a timely way. So I don't have quite the concern that you maybe expressed in that regard. I'm confident that we'll have that water right split off. Also want to mention that we had a Water Resources Association meeting. As you know, I chair that association. And a couple of, I think, significant things for this agency happened at that meeting, and of course you're all always welcome to attend. The county presented a discussion on the county policy towards the Delta currently, and I think it might be appropriate at some time for that to come to this agency, because much of what's going on in the Delta could impact our processes in a very great way, and I think the county is our partner. We have a supervisor here with us on this board, and we ought to be aware of of the policy that the county is trying to move forward with in regards to the Delta. Also had a significant presentation which was an update as to the groundwater monitoring that is actually happening within our county. As we know, that we formed an entity pursuant to the requirements of the Department of Water Resources, and that entity combines and pools our efforts under the auspices of the Water Resources Association of Yolo County, and we received some interesting updates about some of how that water monitoring is going. Also had a very timely discussion from John Woodling of the Regional Water Authority. And Mr. Woodling's been here, has requested that we give consideration to becoming a part of the Regional Water Authority. I don't know where that is in the process with staff. I'm sure it's somewhere on your radar screen, but I'd encourage that we have that discussion at the board level at the appropriate time. I think some of the activities of the Regional Water Authority are very much activities that we ought to be partnered with them on. And we had a meeting over the last month with Ann Sanger at Congresswoman Matsui's office. This was another meeting with the entities that I just described from RD 2035 and NACWA. And I think we have a partner in the Congresswoman on this effort. She's jointly signed a letter relating to the restoration funding, and is interested in the course of this project here in Woodland. One of the things that I asked in the meeting I previously referenced with the Bureau of Reclamation was whether or not they had any history of a joint ag-urban project of this type, where there was a joint ag-urban intake of water, and they could not describe one in their memory banks. That made the project significant to them. And I know we've espoused that, but I just wanted you to know that they said we were it, and we were pioneering some new territory, and I thought that was nice. Yesterday, I attended a meeting with that same group with Assemblywoman Yamada and talked to her about her support, and also the need we have to have her signature on the next letter that we take back with us to Washington, D.C. We have all the local entities involved in that letter, and so would encourage staff to follow up with her office in that regard. I already referenced the meeting at the Bureau of Reclamation. I also want to reference a meeting that was held with the YOLO Taxpayers Association. They asked several of us to be on a panel and to discuss this project. And about 40 or 50 questions they had in regards to this project, and any question was fair game. And I'm very happy to report that I felt the tenor of that meeting and the line of questioning was nothing but positive. And I think in the end, the only concern I really heard expressed was, well, it ought to be a Chevy and not a Cadillac. And I think we all feel like this is anything but a Cadillac in terms of what we're doing, but we are working hard to keep the costs down. And I was very proud of staff that were at that meeting and were involved in that discussion. And then last of all, I attended the dedication and grand opening of the Vineyard surface water treatment plant in Sacramento. And that was, I would just encourage board members to go over there, because that plant is very much designed along the nature of what we're doing. They also take groundwater and have to mix groundwater into their surface water, which comes from Freeport. And very enlightening for me, who am not an engineer, to actually see visually how this water treatment process goes, because it's one thing to read it on paper, but it's another thing to actually get the view of it, and that was fascinating to me. So anyway, that's all I'd like to say, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Quite welcome, and as always, very busy, and appreciate it very much, Bill. I failed to take any public comment on the items that we have had before us. Did any of you want to speak to those items before we close out this meeting? Seeing none, not rushing forward, then I guess I was okay. We'll go back down here. Mr. Saylor.
Thanks. There are a couple of thoughts that come to mind listening to the conversation here. First of all, there is the Bay Delta Conservation Plan draft EIR is out for comment, and I don't know if you brought it up here, but I'm understanding that the time frame for comment initially was set for the first week of January, and it's been extended by 30 days, is my understanding. So if this agency has an opportunity to take a look at it, you may have comments that are relevant just to the project at hand. That's one item. Second, there is a group of 5 Delta counties who have been meeting on the Bay Delta issues for some time, and a group of representatives from that consortium went to Washington last week and had conversations with a lot of the people that Director Marble was describing. There are opportunities for sharing in those conversations, and I'll talk to Dennis about that after the meeting. There may be other opportunities there. And both David Guy from NACWA and John Woodley are participating in an effort that SACOG has going, which is a regional water focus. So we will, Joe and I both are members of that board, so there are opportunities to interact there as well. That I think that's gonna come up pretty soon. The last item is that about last week I had an opportunity to tour RD 108, which is just north of some of the areas that we're talking about, and it's a pretty amazing thing. They've got I think 3 intake facilities, and the one that I spent most time with was active. It had I think it had 6 pumps going, and this is 100 years old basically. I think 1917 basically in that time period, and it's worth a trip.
Yes, they are, and they're large, very large agency,
Yeah.
and they are part of the WRA.
It's about a 50,000 acre area with I think 8,000 acres they own. Some years back there was a default on payments, and the family let the property revert to the district. So that now is a big part of how they pay their bills. Very interesting.
Bill, you mentioned the groundwater monitoring program that's taking place as a report that came to the WRA. Is that document up on the website?
It is. You can go to the WRA website, and it'll link you right to it.
Great. I think that'd be a
And
good-
it's also now on state websites by requirement.
Great, that'd be a good document to read. Anything further? Seeing none, that moves us to adjournment.
Move adjournment.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. This meeting is adjourned.